Hey, welcome to my YouTube channel, Redhead Professor. And on this episode, we're going to be looking at break-even point. And break-even point is that fun place in business where you have equaled out or balanced out your company's revenue with your expenses. So you haven't made any money, but you covered all your costs. So you can it's like the break-even or like the big sigh moment, like, oh my goodness, I at least I've covered my costs and I'm not forking it out of my own pocket anymore to cover these things. So break-even point is important for companies. Up to this point, before you can do the break-even analysis, you've got to understand fixed costs, variable costs, and you've got to be able to calculate your unit contribution margin, your contribution margin per unit, contribution margin ratio. Those things become essential to be able to perform the break-even analysis. So for the break-even analysis, we can do break-even in sales, in units, or we can look at dollar amount. And the formula is just a tad different between the two of them. So if we're looking at it per unit, like how many units do we need to sell to break even, to cover our fixed costs, cover our expenses, and be good? We can look at it per unit, or we can look at how many dollars in sales do we need to sell to be magically at that 0 point where we've covered all of our fixed and variable costs. So units, if we're looking at it from the point of units, we take fixed costs and divide it by the unit contribution margin. And if we're looking at it from the point of sales dollars, like actual cash, we take fixed costs and divide it by the contribution margin ratio. So just to show you some examples of how that works, we have Nate Co. And he sells product A for $120 per unit and has a variable cost of $70 per unit, and his fixed costs are $160,000. So for break-even sales in units, we take fixed costs and we divide it by the unit contribution margin. So the fixed costs are $160,000, and we're going to divide it by the unit contribution margin. And just to back up a sec, the unit contribution margin, which we covered in a previous video, was sales price per unit minus variable costs per unit. So sales price per unit was $120. So $120. And that was sales price per unit minus variable cost per unit. So variable cost per unit was 70. So we have 120, take out 70, and we end up with $50 per unit. Make that actually. So to do the break-even sales in units, we take the fixed costs and divide it by the unit contribution margin, which we just figured out what the unit contribution margin was. So now we can take and we can plug in both pieces of this. The fixed costs at I'll do it right here. 160,000. Those are our fixed costs. And we're going to divide it by our contribution margin, which was this $50 right here. So we take 160,000, divide it by 50, and that actually should be a number, not a dollar amount. What do you want? Okay. So 3,200 units. We have to sell that many, and then we have covered our costs that go into each unit and our costs for the building, the heat, those fixed costs that come whether we sell any units or not. So 3,200 is the magic amount we need to sell just to cover our behinds. Now, break-even sales, we can look at it again from a different perspective, and this perspective is going to be from just pure money. And to calculate that, we take fixed costs, which are 160,000, and we divide it by our contribution margin ratio. The contribution margin ratio, if you didn't get this in the earlier video, go back and watch it, but I'll go over it quickly. The contribution margin ratio was contribution margin divided by sales. So the contribution margin back up to this one, was sales minus variable costs. So sales minus variable costs is our contribution margin divided by sales. So sales, 120 minus our variable costs of 70 give us 50. So sales minus variable cost gives us our contribution margin. Then our contribution margin divided by sales gives us our contribution margin ratio. So this is our contribution margin. I'm just going to mark it. So contribution margin. And we're going to divide that by sales to get the contribution margin ratio. So 50 divided by the sales price of 120. 50 divided by 120. And then I'm going to change it to a percent. So we get 42% is our contribution margin ratio. There we go. So a little bit of work before we can do this one. And then we take our fixed costs for break-even sales, in dollars, and we divide it by the contribution margin ratio. So the fixed costs are $160,000, and we're going to divide it by that contribution margin ratio. So 160,000 divided by 42% gives us $384,000 that we've got to sell to break even in sales, which if we look up here, another way of doing that would be up here we said we had to sell 3,200 units to break even. Well, 3,200 units times how many units did we, well, how much did we say each unit was? 120 per unit. Doesn't like that. Sorry. Oh, you gotta love Excel. 3,200 times $120. $384,000. So it comes out the same whether you do it either way. It's just a different way of looking at it. But we came up with, we had to sell 3,200 units. That was our break-even sales in units, which we took our fixed costs, which are $160,000, and divided by our unit contribution margin, which our unit contribution margin was sales price minus variable costs. Gives us our contribution margin per unit of $50. So fixed cost of $160,000 divided by unit contribution margin of 50 said that we had to sell 3,200 units to break even, to cover our sales, or to cover our variable costs and our fixed costs. For the break even amount in sales for dollars, we took our fixed costs again, but this time we divided it by contribution margin ratio, which was taking the contribution margin of $50 and dividing it by the sales amount or the sales price of 120, gave us a 42% contribution margin ratio. And then we took our fixed cost and divided it by the contribution margin ratio, and it gave us our answer in dollars. So 3,200 units or $384,000 in sales to cover our costs and be at zero.